Okay, we're at 5 minutes here, so I'm going to get things rolling. Once again, thank you everyone for taking the time out to come see this webinar. So as an introduction, Brian Kennedy and I, Jeremy Boychyn, will be hosting this webinar. Brian is Grower Relations and Extension Manager. I am Agronomy Research Extension Specialist. We're both with Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions. And really the purpose and the goal of this webinar and this webinar series was to find a way to extend and bring closer researchers and research to the agronomists, to the farmers, to industry people in Alberta and in Western Canada, considering the situation we're in where maybe interactions between producers and agronomists and researchers has been a little bit challenged. So I wanted to find a way to maybe create some dialogue and hit on some timely topics that agronomists and farmers will be talking about. And this can be kind of practical applications of how to manage problems in fields or how to approach a certain agronomy topic. So that was really the goal that was in mind when we were building this. So the way that I've set this up with our presenters is I essentially give them the opportunity to either pre-record the webinar or to attend it live, depending on what their schedule looks like. And Breanne Tideman has a little one at home that she's also managing at the same time as she's managing this webinar. So we thought it would be a good idea to pre-record, but she's here to answer any questions over audio or over Q&A or over the chat. So feel free to engage over any three of those options as the webinar is going. We will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you want to hold on to your questions to the end, we can address those then. But feel free to engage. And there's three ways you can engage. You can raise your hand, and that will give me the opportunity to open up your mic, and you can ask a question directly. There is the Q&A button at the bottom. So if you ask in the Q&A there, it'll come directly to us panelists. And we'll be able to answer that directly and have that as the webinar is still going. Or there's the chat function. And when you use the chat function, if you set up the chat function, so there's a little button at the bottom that says either to panelists or to all attendees and panelists. You can click and decide who you want to see your question. I would recommend sharing it to the whole group because likely there's other people with similar questions. So if you change that, then everyone can kind of see what you're what you're asking, and I think they can even upvote what you're asking if they really want the answer to that question. So feel free to use all of those options. So we have Dr. Breanne Tideman here. She's working out of the Lacombe Research Station. And actually, you know what? Since you're on, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and let everyone know what you do, what you're working on, and then we can get the webinar recording going.
Sure. So, like Jeremy said, I'm a research scientist for Ag Canada at the Lacombe Research and Development Center. My program there focuses on basically non-herbicide management of weeds, so integrated weed management, looking at novel tools and techniques. In particular, I've focused a lot in the last few years on harvest weed seed control. I know there's a few of you that recognize me as the seed destructor girl. That would be me. There's also a few of you that recognize me as the new Neil, as in Neil Harker's replacement. That is also me. So I hope the tips are helpful and applicable. And like Jeremy said, this is pre-recorded so that hopefully we don't have too many little person interruptions as we go.
Thanks, Breanne. So again, I asked Breanne to kind of hit on some of the top 10 weed tips for early season weed control. These are very practical, applicable tactics that you can take into the field when you're asking the question of, okay, how do I now address my early season weed control challenges? And we realize that there's going to be variety in how farmers and agronomists are addressing these, considering we have excess moisture last year and heading into this year in parts of the north, and maybe dry conditions in the south. So they're kind of practical steps that you can take to approach these scenarios. But I want to, before we get going, is kind of let everyone know that the conversation doesn't need to stop here. I mean, reaching out to Breanne and I and Brian after the fact, if there's follow-up questions or anything that you're looking for in more detail, we're happy to continue that conversation, because we picture this as just kind of the beginning of the conversation, but it continues well into the season after that. So hopefully everyone can see. I'm going to put myself on mute, and we'll get this rolling. Oh, I forgot to mention, Breanne had a little bit of trouble counting when we recorded this. So it's broken up into 2 videos. The first one is 1 to 10 without number 4, and then the second video will be just number 4. So just know when we finish this first video, there will be another short 2 to 3 minute video after that, to cover all 4 of the tips. So.
Harvest last year. If not, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But just some things to really keep in mind as we're kicking off this field season to hopefully make it a good one. So let's jump right in. Tip number 1 is to scout. It is really important that you see what's going on in your field. What are you actually dealing with? Do you have winter annuals out there? What species are in your field? Keep an eye out, especially for early emerging weeds like kochia. What's actually there? And is there anything different there than what you would have expected in previous years? It's really important, if you're going to manage those weeds, that you actually know what's there. So the very first tip of almost any time, but especially in the early season, is to get out and scout. Now, look again is tip number 2. What I mean by that is, when I say to scout, I don't mean the 60-kilometer-an-hour drive-by, look out the driver's side window and see if you can see some green. I mean boots on the ground in the field, actually looking at what's there. And it's really important that you have those boots on the ground, because some weeds can be really, really hard to see. So in the right-hand picture, that is a cleaver that I took a picture of a cleaver emerging one spring. It took me about 5 minutes on my hands and knees to probably find that thing. You have to kind of get your eyes in for some of these early emerging weeds, especially when we have nights that are still cold or cool, possibly even freezing in some areas. A lot of times that cold stress will actually make the weeds come up more of a purplish color than a true green. So like the cleaver in the picture there, that picture is not edited at all. That is the color the cleaver came up. And it's not uncommon. So just doing a quick walk by looking for green, you may not actually see those weeds. Sometimes you have to get sort of nose to the ground to see what's going on. The other big thing about looking again, move the trash. Areas of high residue are notorious for having weeds hiding underneath there. When you actually move those clumps of straw, a lot of times you'll find all kinds of cotyledons coming out. Volunteer canola is a really good example of this. If you have a lot of canola residue in your field, move some of that residue out of the way, because chances are you will find some weeds hiding under that residue that are already growing. So look again. Scouting is important. Looking again and looking really closely is also really important. Tip number 3, and I know I'm sounding repetitive, is I'm begging you, please go look. You have to know what's there. You need to know your stages. If you've got winter annuals that are already getting, that 6-7 whorl, if it's a cleaver, you need to do a pre-seed burn-off or a control measure sooner rather than later, because a lot of our pre-seed burn-off chemicals are not registered for large winter annuals. They have to still be smaller. So know what's there, know the stages, know the species, know the resistance profile. If you have kochia in your field, is it glyphosate resistant? If you've not had glyphosate resistance in your field before, it's worth looking. If you have kochia growing, is it growing in a nice little roll pattern where it may have rolled from somewhere else and could potentially be glyphosate resistant? Know the species. Kochia is a great example where you may not have had kochia in your field the year before and it's rolled in from a neighbor's field, and what you were planning to use as a burn-off may not actually control that species, right? Volunteer canola is another one where, you know, knowing that you have it there may change your game plan for what management you're going to use. Now this year, because of the harvest that we had in 2019, all the joys and excitement of that harvest, there's a good chance that you're going to have more volunteers, especially if your crop had to overwinter. Just sitting there under snow, having animals move across it, having the weight of the snow, the melting, the drying, all of that kind of thing, we will see more grain shatter, canola shatter. There will be more volunteers there. So you need to also think about how are you going to manage those? What does that add in terms of complexity to your management strategy? You know, there may be more winter annuals this year. Very few farmers, as far as I'm aware, had time to do any kind of post-harvest spray or fall burn-off because of winter annual. So winter annual cleavers, if you're in a heavy cleavers area, that might be something that you're wanting to look at. And again, if they're winter annuals, you really have to watch your timing for when you're doing that pre-seed burn-off. Because again, if you're doing a burn-off and you're using herbicides, some of them are not registered to take care of really big winter annuals. So you have to get out there when they're still small enough to be manageable. Tip number 5, and I just realized I don't have a tip number 4. That's interesting. Tip number 4, we'll just say is a repeat of 1, 2, and 3, and let's go. Some more. Sorry, guys. Tip number 5 is to use more than just glyphosate. This is opportunity number 1 in the growing season to help prevent resistance. So if you're in a mindset where you use herbicide rotations and you use tank mixing in crop and everything like that, that is fabulous. But this is actually your first opportunity to help prevent resistance. So it's really important that you put something else in the tank in addition to glyphosate. If you have a weed that has glyphosate resistance, even if it's just developing, so you may not be aware of the glyphosate resistance yet, you could really expand the problem quickly. So again, I'm going to refer to kochia. It's our glyphosate resistant weed in Western Canada at this point in time. If you had a kochia plant last fall that had developed glyphosate resistance and set seed, and you only use glyphosate in your burn-off, you could end up in a big problem very quickly. Resistance is also a numbers game. It always has been, it always will be. It is a numbers game. The more plants that you apply a single mode of action to, the more likely you are to find the individual that has the ability to resist that herbicide. So in this picture on the right here, this is lamb's quarters. They were treated with another product, so they turn, they're showing here as hot pink. That's a different herbicide symptomology, but it allows you to see them really quickly. But this is one very small little piece of area with probably 20 or so lamb's quarters in there, if not more. If you're spraying an entire field and you've got a heavy population of weeds like that, that is an awful lot of numbers being exposed to just glyphosate in one go. So something that you really need to pay attention to, something to be concerned about. When something else in the tank. Having said that, please check your residuals and your recropping, especially if you, for whatever reason, changed your game plan in that field for what you're going to seed, because it's a late spring, because of a market change, whatever it is. Make sure you check your residuals or your recropping. So if you throw something else in the tank, make sure it's safe to go in ahead of whatever crop you're putting in. you know, if you're throwing a little extra in for control of your cleavers or throwing something in for control of your volunteer canola, that's a really good thing. Just make sure it's safe for whatever crop you're putting in, because you would never want to add something into the tank for a weed management strategy that then causes your crop damage. I know that's very self-explanatory, but just a gentle reminder here to check out your blue book or your guide to crop protection in whatever province you're in, and make sure you look at those residuals recropping. Tip number 6, set yourself up for a herbicide layering strategy. So if you're adding something in the tank anyways, because of tip number 5, why not add something that has a residual intentionally, something that, according to the guide to crop protection, is good for your crop, it's registered for your crop, but that adds a different mode of action than what you're going to be using in crop and has some residual, especially on those weeds where using multiple modes of action in crop is a challenge. So a really good example here would be wild oat. If you have group 1 and group 2 resistant wild oat, which is occurring in a number of fields, how do you effectively use multiple modes of action in crop? There really aren't any additional options. So wild oat is a really good example of put something down pre that has some residual efficacy on wild oats. Look at something like a group 8, a trialate, or a group 15, a focus with pyroxasulfone, something like that that has some residual efficacy. Then you can add your group 1 or your group 2 in crop and still be getting multiple modes of action being effective on that weed. So especially where multiple modes of action in crop are really limited, usually because of resistance, you know, consider what you're putting in the tank and see if you can at least move into a herbicide layering strategy then. A herbicide layering strategy, it's multiple effective modes of action in time in their crop, and it is definitely better than nothing. So if you can't do multiple modes of action in crop at the same time with a tank mix, herbicide layering is a really good way of getting that additional mode of action in. Tip number 7, emergence timing of weeds versus crop. So this is something that's really important. We get asked about the importance of an in-crop and, you know, does it really matter if the weed's up first compared to the crop? We know early season and early in-crop weed control is important. This is some numbers that were quoted by Neil Harker and John O'Donovan from work that they did in the 2000s. They were both mentors of mine at Ag Canada and Lacombe. They figured that one weed that emerges a week before the crop is equal to 100 weeds that emerge 3 weeks after the crop. So what that's saying, and that's in terms of the effect on yield. So what that's saying is that those weeds that come up before the crop have far more impact on yield individually than a weed that comes up after the crop. So this graph, this is from Chris Willenberg at the University of Saskatchewan, and it can be a little bit confusing here, but on the x-axis is the wild oat relative time of emergence, and this is using growing degree days, but here's your 0. So at 0 is where the crop and the wild oat would emerge at the same time, and the oat, or the crop in this case, is tame oats, but this same relationship would occur in almost every crop, or in every crop. So at 0 is where they emerge at the same time. Minus 50, minus 100 is where the wild oat is up first. And then 50 and 100 is where the crop is up first. And then what you also see here is wild oat density. So obviously more weeds, there's going to be a bigger yield impact, right? So we see that here, where as our density increases, so does our yield increase. But here's what's interesting. If you look at where the crop came up first, right? So the wild oats came up after the crop. What we're seeing is a yield impact of, say, about 45 to 50%, okay? As the wild oat comes up before the crop, we start to see a yield impact of 75%, okay? That's yield loss. So we're just gonna go back for a second here. What this means is that, you know, if it came down to you can either fit in a pre-seed burn-off, or you can fit in an early in crop. The one that's going to have the biggest impact on your yield is probably the pre-seed burn-off, because those weeds that come up first, they have the competitive advantage over the crop in terms of getting access to light, getting access to moisture, getting access to nutrients. Their root systems and their leaf systems will always be more developed than what the crops are. And so they're always going to have that competitive edge against the crop. So managing those weeds that are up before the crop is really, really critical. It's why the early season weed control is so important, because they have that competitive advantage. So this also goes back to your scouting. Those winter annuals that are already there, those need to be managed because they have such a competitive edge over the crop. They've already been growing for how many months, right? Picking which field you should prioritize next should be determined by what you're going to seed next and how many weeds are up on that field. If you don't have any weeds up on your field and you've looked really closely, nose to the ground, scouted, looked, then the pre-seed burn-off may not be as important. That's something we saw a little bit last year because we were so dry prior to seeding. This year we probably aren't going to see it as much unless you happen to be in a very dry area. But here, at least in central Alberta, where I'm at right now, we had a very late melt in terms of our snow melt, and so there's been quite a bit of moisture and weeds have just kind of been popping right up. So I think in a lot of locations there is going to be weeds to manage with a pre-seed burn-off, and it's important to keep in mind, if you do a pre-seed burn-off on all of your fields at the same time, and there's a field that sits there for 2 weeks because the weather got crappy between your pre-seed burn-off and your actual seeding time, how many weeds came up in those 2 weeks that are now going to be up before your crop again, right? So really thinking about your order of when you're doing things can be really important here. Tip number 8, do what you can to give the crops the edge. So in addition to timing of emergence, so understanding that, when to do your pre-seed burn-off to give the crop the advantage. Other things to consider here, what seeding rate are you using? Is it a competitive seeding rate that if you have some insect damage or some disease loss or damping off or drought or whatever, is that seeding rate going to be competitive with the weeds that are there? Is the species soil temperature sensitive? So if you're seeding soybeans, maybe not so much in central Alberta, but in other areas of Alberta or in other prairie provinces, is it soil temperature sensitive, and are you at that soil temperature threshold yet? Because if you put a soil temperature sensitive species in before you hit that threshold, you're going to disadvantage the crop. Is it seed treated? Is it something that needs to be seed treated to manage seedling diseases? If that crop gets knocked back by a seedling disease and stunted, that might allow the weed to catch up and or gain the competitive advantage for the crop. Are you feeding the crop with a weed in terms of your nutrients? Where are you putting those nutrients? Is it going to your crop or is it going to the weeds? Are there early season insects? Canola is an obvious example here with flea beetles. Have you seed treated for them? Do you have a seeding rate that can withstand some feeding, or is an early season insect, pea leaf weevil and peas, it's going to knock them back so much that the weeds are going to be able to catch up or outcompete your crop? So just a quick picture example here. This is some work that was done in Denmark, and it helps show the type of advantage that you can give to the crop. This is an extreme example, but it's a really nice illustration. So I know it's extreme. I know you wouldn't use these seeding rates and this methodology in your crop, but just bear with me for the illustration. So in this picture, what we have is canola seeded at 200 seeds per square meter and wheat seeded at 200 seeds per square meter in 5-inch rows. Now in this case, the wheat is the crop, the canola is the weed. So it's a volunteer canola that has been seeded because weed scientists are nuts and we do crazy things like this. But again, bear with me. So you can see here at flowering canola stage, how much canola is flowering in there. There's quite a few happy, healthy canola plants, which again are the weed in this case. Now, if you up your seeding rate,
So this is again canola, 200 seeds per square meter. Now the wheat has been seeded at 600 seeds per square meter. And I know that's high, and I know these are really narrow rows, but again, it's the principles that we're talking about here. If you look at this picture compared to the first one, there's a heck of a lot less flowering canola happening here and a lot more happy, healthy looking wheat, right? Just by increasing the seeding rate. That's giving the crop a competitive edge. This third picture, this is again canola at 200 seeds per square meter, wheat at 600 seeds per square meter, but this is uniform seeding, so it's not seeded into rows. Again, I know this isn't something we actually do in the field, but look at the impact of distribution of seeds here. And again, giving the crop the competitive edge in terms of where that crop is in space, right? What I'm trying to get at here is, yes, these are extreme, but giving the crop the competitive edge can make a big difference in terms of your overall outcome for your weed management. It's little things. It's those sound agronomics that you need to take the time to really make conscious decisions about, but they can have a big impact on your weed management outcome. Tip number 9, we are in a time crunch, so what if you can't do it all? Harvest 2019, spring 2020, they have not been overly kind. Harvest was, yet again, a harvest from hell. Spring 2020 has been late in most areas, as far as I know anyways, and they haven't given a lot of time for getting the harvest off that wasn't harvested last year, and getting into the field and having a lot of time to really think and plan about what you're doing in each of those fields. I want to emphasize that a pre-seed burn-off is critical if weeds are up and growing. We're equivalent in terms of their yield. The late seeding ended up being a yield penalty of something like 30% or something like that. It was substantial anyways. It really emphasized how important that early weed control is. And if you think about it from sort of a balance sheet, like a bank account, your soil has a set level of moisture and nutrients in it at the start of the spring. Any weeds that are growing prior to your crop or growing early in the spring before you get your crop in and going are depleting that bank account of moisture and nutrients before your crop can even have access to it. So it's a bank account, your crop is getting that second card, but someone's already spending a whole bunch of that money before it has its access card, okay? It's really critical. Again, in years where there's not a lot of weeds growing, last year's a great example, maybe it wasn't so critical. This year, I really do think it is. The number of volunteers we're going to have, the moisture we've had, the late spring, I think it's really important, even if you're in a time crunch, I think it's important to try and get that pre-seed burn off in. If I had to choose, I think I would choose the pre-seed burn off over an early in crop. It just makes sense in terms of that balance sheet. You know, give the crop a chance to access that account before the weeds are spending it down. I've had questions before about, you know, doing 2 burn-offs, doing one really early and then a second one before you seed the crop. If you have the time, the money, the energy to do it, and you've got weeds growing both times, it's not a bad idea, because every one of those weeds that come up are taking moisture and nutrients. And again, if those weeds are up before the crop, you're going to have issues in terms of competitive advantage. Chances of you having the time, the energy, the money to do 2 burn-offs, probably not great. So making sure, I honestly would make sure that your pre-seed burn-off and your seeding are relatively close together to minimize the amount of time those weeds have to get up and growing before your crop. So we're almost to tip number 10, kind of -1 since I apparently didn't have a tip number 4. What are you going to do? It's working evenings and craziness, right? Tip number 10, managing weeds is a season-long battle. So if for whatever reason everything piles up against you, it is windy every single day that you have an opportunity to spray and you don't get a pre-seed burn-off in, managing weeds is a season-long battle or season-long war, and this is the first battle of many if you want to look at it that way, okay? So think about not only what you can do early season, but what can you do this summer, this fall, maybe this winter that gives yourself an advantage or a jump on your early season weed control for next year. Are there things that you can do to help drive the seed bank down? So, you know, this summer, using proper herbicide resistance management strategies, using multiple effective modes of action, tank mixing, all of those good strategies are important to make sure that you manage your seed bank so that the early season weed control maybe isn't as critical next year because you had some management of the seed bank. You know, consider out of the box things like clipping seed heads. You know, preventing those seed bank inputs is really important. I'm, being me, always going to put a plug in for harvest weed seed control, which is where the picture of the Harrington seed destructor comes in over here. On the right hand side, there it is. The whole point of harvest weed seed control is exactly that, prevent the weed seeds from going into the seed bank and being a problem next year. So it's really important to take the time when you can think about your weed control, not only for this year, but also for next year. Those strategies that you're putting in play, what are they giving you next year? What are they allowing you to try next year? Maybe you can grow a less competitive crop. Maybe you can try a different crop that doesn't have a lot of herbicide options because you're managing those weed seeds throughout the entire year this year. So again, if the pre-season burn-off just absolutely cannot happen, try not to fret too much because it is a season-long battle. And I encourage all of you to take the time to build a strategy for that battle for the entire year. I'm hoping these tips will help you get the year off to a good start. Sending all of you my best wishes for a 2020 season. I hope I get to talk to you throughout the season in person rather than just over my computer, which means that we're back in the field and things are returning to some kind of normal. I've got my email address there as well as my Twitter handle. Would love to chat to you about weeds at any time. Just feel free to reach out, and I hope to see you sometime soon, and I hope you guys have a great season.
All right, we're going to switch over to the next one.
Tip number 4 and bringing it back to you. I figured not many people would really want to take tips from a scientist that can't even count to 10. So, hey guys, I'm back. I was mortified enough that I didn't have a tip number 4 that I went and made a tip number 4 and bringing it back to you. I figured not many people would really want to take tips from a scientist that can't even count to 10. So, I'm back. We're going to say my pretend tip number 4 is make sure you're taking time for yourself and getting adequate sleep, especially before trying to do a webinar. But here's my real tip number 4. Keep an eye on the weather. And what I'm referring to here is temperatures overnight. So plants need to be actively growing for them to take in a herbicide application. When we get freezing temperatures overnight, that slows a plant's metabolism down. Now, it's not such a big deal if you're using a contact herbicide that doesn't need to move through the plant. But if you're using a herbicide that translocates or that needs to move through the plant, freezing temperatures can essentially cause it to get stuck. So the plant slows its metabolism down so much that it's not moving that herbicide through the plant. And what will happen is it will burn off a leaf. but it doesn't actually control the entire plant because it didn't move through the plant to the growing points to actually control it. So if it freezes overnight, if it goes below zero, take your time, catch your breath. You want to wait a half day or a full day before you're applying that herbicide. It's going to take some time, some heat, some sunshine for those plants to really wake up and start moving resources around again. And if you're not waiting, you're, like I said, that herbicide may not be effective. Now, try to target days without freezing before them for burn-offs. Now, I know there's some of you going, how many things do you really want us to target? You want us to have no wind, no freezing, the proper timing, everything else. Again, it's a challenge. I do understand that. But the most expensive herbicide that you can apply is the one that doesn't work, right? Your waste of money. So there is no point to applying a herbicide if the plant is not actually going to move through or not going to be killed. So take the breath, take that time. Don't scramble like I did, pulling tip number 4 together. Keep your eye on the weather and try and plan accordingly. If you've got a freezing night coming up, maybe that's where you go and seed one of your other fields. After it's warmed up for a bit, that's when you go out and do your spraying. Keep an eye on the weather. Now that you actually do have 10 tips for early season weed control, like I said, best of luck with the season. Get in touch if you want to chat.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Breanne. So we can open this up to questions now. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type into the Q&A, type into the chat, or raise your hand, and I can open you up so you can ask directly to Breanne and I. So I actually have a question, Breanne. I don't see anything popping up right now, so I'm going to ask. A lot of the discussion around making sure that you have all the weeds that are up controlled before your crop emerges, because if they are already up, they're already taking advantage of sunlight, of moisture, of nutrients. And they're removing that availability from your crop, which is decreasing the value of all those inputs that you put in the ground. And being a plant physiologist, I can't help but think of the non-visual interactions that can happen between weeds and the crop. Is there any type of role that plays into that plant changing its maybe physiological structure or the way that it wants to grow? Because if it emerges and immediately knows that it is in a high competition area, does that also play a role into why maybe we're not seeing as high of a yield from that crop? Or is it just that those nutrients and that water and that sunlight is not as available?
So actually, Clarence Swanton from the University of Guelph and some of his grad students have done a lot of work on this area, primarily with corn and soybean. But what happens is weeds that are already up and growing, they absorb light in the red wavelength of light, and they reflect far red light. When a crop plant is receiving a higher ratio of far red light, because that's what's being reflected from the weeds, it can actually completely change their physiology. So it can change their physical growth, but there's also cellular cascades that happen. Some of the work that was done by one of the grad students at the University of Guelph, Andrew Mackenzie Gopsel, showed that having weeds early in the season, even prior to emergence, if there's additional stresses, those plants will never recover the initial yield loss from the weeds being there prior to the crop emerging. So that initial change in the light environment can completely change the plant's yield potential, absolutely.
Do you think it's breaking that residue barrier? So you'd shown that image of kind of the weed being underneath the residue and getting ready to emerge from there. Do you think there's still that impact that's happening if the weed still hasn't emerged from the residue, or do you think it can get through there?
As soon as the weed is able to absorb light, it's going to start reflecting that far red light. So if it can absorb any wavelength of light from under that residue, it can already be occurring.
Okay. So we have a question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee who wants to stay secretive, and we'll answer it live here. Is there any work on the economics on the gains from higher seeding rate versus herbicide weed control?
Oh, I would have to dig back into the literature on that, to be completely honest. I know anytime that the work has been done, higher seeding rates equals better weed control, even when whether you have herbicides included or not. In terms of the economics, obviously it's crop dependent, and I would honestly have to dig back into some of the work that Neil did with Alwyn Smith and see if they actually did the economics on that, or some of the other economists. But it's a little bit tough to answer, because that answer can change every year as the economics of your seed, your inputs, even your crop pricing, as those change as well. So it's a bit of a moving target in a sense. But from a weed control standpoint, typically higher seeding rate is better weed control. How that measures out money-wise, like I said, I'd have to check.
So Breanne, are you saying that when you use a herbicide with a higher seeding rate, the efficacy of that herbicide is it works better at a higher seeding rate versus a lower seeding rate, or what is that saying?
Yeah, so even when you're using full rates of herbicides, if you increase your seeding rate, you will see a better weed control, because you've got the addition of the competition. So Neil and John and a number of their colleagues did some work where they cut herbicide rates in half, which we do not recommend doing. This is not Breanne recommending cut rates of herbicides, just for the record. But even where the herbicide rate was halved, just so that you could clearly see differences in the seeding rate, it was a little bit more visual. As soon as you have increased seeding rate plus a herbicide, that's always going to be your best weed control.
So I haven't seen any other questions pop up, but I do actually, I have another question. I'm going to take advantage of those as I can. Oh, we did have one pop up here from Lauren. Re-spring harvest, you touched on the reality that many farmers weren't able to do a post-harvest treatment. Do you anticipate, or have you seen any other impacts due to spring harvest? For instance, in terms of species or staging?
So I would expect that we may see some more winter annuals, especially for producers that would typically do a post-harvest treatment to manage some of those winter annuals. You may, in some cases, if you got your harvest off, you may, no, I'm going to take that back. Forget I said anything. So yeah, probably some more winter annuals. You may also see some more perennials. Pre-harvest, post-harvest treatments are a common time frame for us to target perennials, because we can get our herbicides into the root system and actually control that root system then. And so if we didn't have the opportunity to do that, we may see more perennial problems this spring. We may see some larger winter annuals if that fall post-harvest was missed. But yeah, the fall or winter annuals would be my biggest concern, along with the perennials.
Wonderful. Anyone else have any questions they want to toss our way? Kind of jumping on that question then, Breanne, we are seeing some evenings dipping down below zero, and we potentially have an increased amount of winter annuals. Would we expect the efficacy or the strength of some of our herbicides to be reduced if these winter annuals are going through more warming and cold periods. I guess a hardening off, you could say. Would it create more challenges that way?
I'm not aware of any work that's been done that shows them to be more resistant to herbicide if they're going through sort of warm and cold periods. They would, I would assume, be less susceptible to cold stress from on and off exposures, but I wouldn't expect it to change herbicide susceptibility unless unless those herbicides again are applied at a time when the plant isn't actually moving things through its system. Just sort of thinking about that a little bit. The other big issue would be, for me anyway, stages. If those winter annuals are allowed to get big enough, that's going to be a problem for herbicide control. Herbicides are only registered to control weeds up to a certain stage, and if because of cold nights or because of trying to get other harvest done or wet conditions, whatever it might be, if we get out there too late, we may see less control of some of those winter annuals.
Thank you. Well, we're not getting any more questions in, and we are at 10 to 12 now. So I think we'll call an end to this. Breanne, thank you for joining us. Brian just popped in there for the video. Thank you everyone else for joining. Hopefully this was beneficial, gave a few things to think about when you're out there scouting or talking to producers. And as I mentioned before, feel free to reach out back to any of us. This is kind of just the beginning of the conversation. So if you have any follow-up questions on any of the content or anything else, feel free to reach out to Breanne or I, or Brian there. He's shaking his wonderful hair. Yes. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.